Heart of the Prince, Chapter 1, Birthday. "Happy birthday, son," King Harold said to Prince Peter. He handed him a box. Peter opened the box to find a pair of brogues. "Thanks, father." Peter hugged his father. Queen Lillian leaned in and handed a brown cardboard box with a blue ribbon wrapped around it. "From me," she said. He eagerly pulled the ribbon off and opened the box. It was marzipan fruits. Peter's face lit up. "Thank you!" He smiled at his mother. "I know you love them," she replied. "Now, you're 15, son," King Harold began. "You should really begin thinking about marriage." Peter sighed and rolled his eyes. "Father," he groaned, "I don't need to get married until I'm 18. I don't want to think about that yet." He wanted to put off getting married for as long as possible, as he didn't care for it. "Well, you ought to at least keep your eye out for someone, otherwise we will pick for you," his father said, and left him with his gifts. His mother kissed his forehead and followed the king out. Peter ate one of the marzipan treats, and got up to change out of his nightclothes. Once Peter was dressed, he went to one of the windows in his room. His room looked out onto a small area of the large gardens and another area of the palace. He decided he would go for a walk in the gardens before guests began arriving for celebrations. Prince Peter was not into big celebrations and gatherings. He preferred to be on his own. Maybe that's why he was not interested in getting married. Or maybe it was that he did not have anyone he wanted to marry. However, the king and queen insisted that he must be married by 18, whether he wanted to or not. And they loved big, extravagant celebrations, so Peter had to comply. As he made his way through the garden paths, blonde hair shining in the sunlight, he spotted someone trimming the hedges by the water fountain. Peter realised he must be the palace gardener, but he had never seen this person before, and he looked much too young to be working. As Peter approached the young gardener, the gardener noticed him and bowed deeply. "Your Highness," he said. Peter didn't care for this gesture. "Please, you don't have to do that," Peter said. The gardener stood back up properly. "Your Highness, I was told to if I were to see you." He looked nervous. "Well, you don't have to by me," he assured the gardener. "And you may call me Peter if you wish." He told the gardener and smiled. The gardener appeared to relax a little. "Say, you seem rather young to be working," Peter said. "I am 15, the gardener said. "Oh, I am 15 today," Peter said happily. "I know. Happy birthday." "And may I ask your name?" Peter asked. "I am James," the gardener told him. "It is nice to meet you, James. I didn't know there was someone of my own age in the palace. I will have to speak to you again." James blinked, surprised at how kind Peter was. Peter began to continue walking when James said, "I hope you appreciate my work at the celebrations tonight." Peter turned and realised James was cutting the hedges into animal shapes for the party his parents were throwing. Peter smiled. "I will," he called back, and continued his walk. The evening came, and Peter put on his best clothes, including a red robe and his prince's crown, before heading to the hall for the celebration to begin. He was forced to meet many royal and noble acquaintances of his parents before he was able to sit down. He sat next to his father. "Did you see anybody you may choose as a wife?" his father asked him. "I already told you, father, I don't want to think about marriage yet," Peter replied. His father sighed. A little way into feasting, Peter asked his father, "Why didn't you tell me about people in the palace who were the same age as me?" "I don't know of any," his father replied. "Oh, well, the gardener is my age," Peter told him. "The gardener?" his father replied, unhappy. "You cannot be associating yourself with people as low-ranking as gardeners," the king told him. "But how am I meant to make friends?" Peter whined. "You have plenty of friends. Prince Edward, the Duke of Westland's son. Oh, and what about the children of King Henry and Queen Eleanor?" Peter was not pleased. These were not his friends. These were people he had been forced into spending time with. Prince Peter and the king spent the rest of the evening coldly ignoring each other as the festivities took place. Later in the evening, Prince Peter went outside to get some air and take a break from the loudness inside. He went to the water fountain, which was now on. There were a couple of guests who wished Peter a happy birthday. He nodded politely. Peter sat on the stone wall that surrounded the fountain and looked up at the animals that were sculpted into the hedges. A lion, a dog, a horse. "You like them?" a voice said from nearby. Peter looked and realised it was James again. He was wearing the same clothes, clearly not invited to the party. "They are very good," Peter said. "Thank you," James replied. "Come, sit down." Peter gestured to the space on the wall next to him. He didn't care what his father said. He could be friends with whoever he wanted, especially if the king couldn't see to tell him not to. James cautiously sat down next to Peter, a little nervous to be with the prince. "Are you enjoying the party?" James asked. Peter sighed. "Not really. I don't like big events like this. I'm forced to talk to people I don't know and pretend I'm having fun," Peter told him. "But you want to sit here with me?" James asked, confused. "Yes, you seem nice," he told him. "Wouldn't you rather spend time with your friends?" James asked. There was a pause. "I don't really have any friends," Peter admitted. James wasn't particularly surprised. He knew how the king was. "Father insists that the people in there are my friends, but I hardly ever see them, and most of them aren't very nice people," Peter told James. James nodded. "Yes, I saw a lot of them coming in while I was planting flowers. They all pretended like I wasn't there, or scowled at me," James said. "That's unfair," Peter replied. "You're a person like any of them." He paused. "And at least you have a soul, unlike any of them," Peter joked, and they snickered together. "Peter!" called the king's voice. James ducked down behind the wall. "I'm coming," Peter called back. He whispered a quick "goodbye" to James, and walked over to the door where his father was stood. "What are you doing outside?" the king asked. "I was just getting some air. It's rather stuffy in here," Peter told the king on his way back through the door. The king didn't question it. Peter spent the rest of the night pretending to have a good time until he could finally go to bed. A couple of days later, Peter was walking down a path in the palace gardens when he spotted James in the distance. Peter walked over to him, but James had his back to him, so didn't see Peter approaching. James was spraying liquid fertilizer on the grass with a small hose. Peter leaned close to James. "What are you doing?" he asked. James jumped and got fertilizer on his feet. Peter laughed, and then James laughed too. "You give me a fright," James said, turning off the hose for a moment. "I'm sorry," Peter said, while still laughing. James got his breath back. "I'm just fertilizing the grass," James told Peter. "I see," Peter replied, although he wasn't exactly sure what it meant. "Do you have to do this with all the grass?" Peter asked. "Any grass that you want to live," James replied. "But there's so much of it." "Yes, it usually takes a couple of days," James told Peter. "And you have to do it all yourself?" "Yes, I do now. There used to be 2 of us, me and my father, but he passed away a couple of months ago. So now I've taken over all the duties, whereas before I used to just be helping." "Oh, I'm very sorry to hear about your father," Peter said. "Thank you," James replied. "And what about your mother?" Peter asked. "She died when I was a baby. I never knew her." "Oh, I'm sorry," Peter said. "Maybe I should stop talking." No, it's all right," James said. Peter was about to tell James something, when... "Prince Peter!" Peter groaned. "Oh, can I not get a break?" he said to himself, but so that James could hear. A thin lady walked with haste towards Peter, her heels clacking on the stone path. She had pointy glasses attached to a string that bounced up and down by the sides of her face as she hurried along. "Prince Peter," she began, catching her breath. "Your lessons have been moved to today now," she told him. He frowned. "But my lessons are meant to be tomorrow," he replied. "Well, they have been moved to today," she said. He sighed. "Fine." He turned to James. "Sorry," he said quietly. "Have fun," James said, to be polite. The lady didn't like this. She took 2 long strides towards him and looked down at him. "Were you told to speak, boy?" she shouted at him. He took a step back in fear. No, no! Peter took hold of the woman's shoulder. I said he could. We were talking before, he assured her. So you did give him permission to speak? She asked. Yes, yes, Peter told her. Very well, then, she said, straightening her blouse as if shouting had made it wrinkle. Then she clicked her finger for Peter to follow her. He did, and gave a little wave to James as he walked back to the palace, and James turned the fertilizer back on. Peter didn't leave the palace much during the next week. He was worried about getting James into trouble like he almost had with the lady. There wasn't a lot to do inside that Peter found any fun. His mother and father seemed to enjoy mooching about the palace and sitting in large rooms with other wealthy people. The only room Peter really liked was the blue room, in which there were card games and chess, but there was never anyone to play with during the day. He went back out into the palace gardens. The gardens were so large, so Peter was sure, if he wasn't looking for James, he would be unlikely to run into him. This was not the case, as after 10 minutes, Peter turned a corner, and James was there, weeding a flower bed. James saw Peter right away. Hello, he said cheerfully, and stood up. Hi, Peter replied. I haven't seen you for a bit, James said. I know, I was staying out of your way, Peter admitted. Why? James asked. Well, I don't want you to get into trouble, and I feel like if I spend more time with you, then you will end up in trouble, Peter told him. James smiled. You don't need to worry about me. I'll be fine. Are you sure? Peter asked. Of course. James then added, if you want to stay away from me, that's fine, but if you're only doing it because you're worried about me, then that's silly. He let Peter know. Peter smiled. I do want to spend time with you, Peter said. I want a friend. James smiled back at him. I would love a friend too. Peter stayed and talked to James for around an hour while James weeded the flower bed. They talked about growing up, and the differences were clear between them. Peter had grown up in luxury, but his parents weren't always there when he wanted them, whereas James grew up in the servants' quarters of the palace, but his father was always there for him. So, you actually grew up here? Peter asked. James nodded. I wonder why I never saw you before. Peter spoke. Well, I used to help my father with small jobs, so I wasn't in the same place for very long, and when I was a child, I was only allowed to stay in the servants' quarters and outside area, unless my father took me anywhere. I see, Peter said. Better late than never to make a friend. Peter smiled. James nodded. He had just finished on the flower bed. What do you do now? Peter asked, interested in the job. I take these weeds to compost, and then I go back inside. I wasn't given any other job to do today, James told him. I see. I would ask you to spend more time talking, but I think my father will be expecting me shortly. That's fine, James replied. I'll see you soon, he said, as he took the bag of weeds with him. Peter nodded and made his way back to the main palace entrance. It had been a few days. Peter was making his way to his chambers. Peter! King Harold called. Yes, father? Peter responded, turning around to face his father. Be prepared for tomorrow, he told his son. Prepared for what? Peter asked. A celebration, of course, the king said. Another one? Peter moaned. Whatever for this time? He asked. There needn't be a reason for festivities, the king claimed, and maybe you can be on the lookout for a young lady. Peter gave a look of disdain at this suggestion. Please tell me the reason for this gathering isn't that. Of course not, the king began. I just enjoy the fun of big gatherings and feasts. Don't you? He asked Peter. No, Peter said. The king just laughed, thinking it a joke. Be prepared, 8 o'clock. The king then turned and walked off. Peter rolled his eyes and sighed. He didn't want another party. He'd only just got over the stress of the last one. Peter went out into the gardens the next morning. He was in the area that was visible from his bedroom windows. It had a bench, a small metal-framed gazebo. There were plenty of shrubs and bushes in this area too. Peter liked this area, as it was mostly cut off from the rest of the grounds, and was almost always empty of others. Some lights had been strung up in the area, most likely in preparation for the party. Peter noticed part of the string of lights had fallen from where it had been hung. He picked it up from the floor, and looked up to see the post it had been attached to. He attempted to reattach it, but he would have needed another arm to do it. Luckily, at that moment, James was walking by and noticed Peter through the small gap from the main grounds. He walked through the gate to see what Peter was doing. "You need some help with that?" James asked. Peter looked over his shoulder to see James there. "Couldn't hurt," he joked back. James came over to help. "You hold that there," James told Peter as he began to wrap the string of lights round the post. The lights were reattached, but James left his hand where it was, resting on top of Peter's. Both Peter and James looked at one another, their faces both lit from the lights, as well as the natural daylight. They were standing very close to each other. James leant forward and kissed Peter quickly. He seemed surprised that he had done it. Peter was also surprised. James was about to apologise and leave. However, Peter grabbed James's shoulders and pulled him into another kiss, longer and more passionate than the first one. They broke away from one another and continued to look into each other's eyes. James smiled, as did Peter. "Well," Peter began, "I didn't plan on that," he said, unsure of what else to say. James laughed nervously and looked away, blushing. "Neither did I," James replied. He looked at Peter again. "Although I did want to," he said. Peter nodded. "Me too." James suddenly remembered that he was meant to be preparing the grounds for the party. "I have to go, lots to do," he said apologetically. "I understand," Peter said. "I'll see you later," he called, as James jogged off towards the main ground. Peter went back in through the opening into the palace from that area. The party was very boring to Peter, although he didn't care much. He was still on a high from his kiss. "You seem happy this evening, Peter," Queen Lillian said to Peter when King Harold had gone to talk to a duke. "I have had a good day," Peter responded. "That's good," she replied. She was about to ask why when she saw serving boys bringing in food platters and became distracted by the delicious foods placed out before her and Peter. King Harold came back and sat on his large chair between them.